Hi, I'm Brandon Grant, Marketing Director here at QuoteWerks. In this video, we're going to walk through how to set up the Kaseya BMS integration with QuoteWerks. The Kaseya BMS integration with QuoteWerks enables you to search for contacts, create and update opportunities, create Kaseya BMS quotes, schedule follow-up activities, and much more. A full list of the features available in the integration can be viewed on the website and the QuoteWerks help file. Okay. So let's get started with setting up the integration. To get started setting up the integration between Kaseya BMS and QuoteWerks, you'll first need to log into QuoteWerks with a user that has administrative rights. If you've done that, go ahead and click on Contacts, Set up Contact Manager, and you'll see the Contact Manager setup window will appear. On the left-hand side, you'll see a list of all the available CRM and PSA systems that QuoteWerks integrates with, and you'll want to make sure you select Kaseya BMS. Once you select Kaseya BMS, you'll then need to start filling out some of the information. The server URL should already be set for you, but if it's not, you can type in bms.kaseya.com. Next, you'll want to add your company/tenant account name to QuoteWerks. So for our example, we're going to go ahead and enter this in here. And then go ahead and click test, and you should get a confirmation that the URL that you specified is valid. You'll see there's a success message, and go ahead and click OK. The next step is you need to add user credentials for the administrator. So since I'm logged in as the administrator in QuoteWerks and setting up this integration, I need to add my Kaseya BMS credentials here. So I'm going to choose change user credentials and put in my username and password. And then save, and then test. And then you should get a confirmation if you've put in the correct username and password that the login was successful. So go ahead and click OK. In addition to setting your credentials here, every user in QuoteWerks will need to set up their user settings. This is done by going to Tools, My Preferences, clicking on the Contact Manager tab, and then adding their Kaseya BMS login credentials. So each user in QuoteWerks will also need to add their Kaseya BMS credentials into QuoteWerks on this Contact Manager tab, and then they'll be good to go. Okay, so let's go back to the setup. So we're going to go back to Contacts, Set up Contact Manager. And then now we're going to click on the Kaseya BMS setup since we have added our user credentials to QuoteWerks, and we'll click on that. This will open up the Kaseya BMS setup window. You'll see it's comprised of three different tabs. We have our Opportunities tab, our Quotes tab, and then our Products tab. We're going to go through each of these tabs and show you the recommended settings, but these can be adjusted and set for how your company uses Kaseya BMS. So the first option you'll see is the completion of sales opportunity from QuoteWerks. The most common selection is the automatic when converting to an order. This means that when you convert a quote to an order in QuoteWerks, we'll automatically update the sales opportunity in Kaseya BMS for you and to mark it as one. This is the selection that most users use. However, we do also have the option to perform that same function when the quote is converted to an invoice. So if you're using the invoice functionality in QuoteWerks instead, you can select this option. The final option is never. This means that QuoteWerks will not update the opportunity in Kaseya when it's won from QuoteWerks. We'll basically leave it alone, so if you need to manually go into Kaseya and make some adjustments and changes before it goes to the next step in your process, you can select the never option here. Like I said, for most companies, the first option will be selected, but the other two options are available. Next, we have our default opportunity statuses. These are the default statuses when we create or update the opportunities in Kaseya. So the default open status typically would be open. However, if you click on the dropdown, you can actually choose one of the other statuses available here. These statuses are pulling directly from Kaseya, so if you want to set a default status of something other than the dropdown, you'll just need to go into Kaseya and add it and then come back into the setup here in QuoteWerks. For default close/1 statuses, we're going to go ahead and mark it as 1. Again, if you click on the dropdown, you can select one of the other statuses. If you want QuoteWerks to update the status when it's been lost, again, click on the dropdown and select the correct status when that opportunity is lost. In addition, for the opportunity statuses, we can also set the default rating and the default type. You'll also see here there's a note that basically says if you decide to leave these two fields blank, we'll use whatever you've set in Kaseya BMS instead as your default. If you want to set a specific default here though, for your rating, click on the drop down, select the rating. Same thing for the type, click on the drop down and select the type. Okay, so let's move on to the next tab. We're going to click on our quotes tab, and this will show us some additional options. Now for many of you, if you're setting this up for the first time, this checkbox may be unchecked, and that's okay. By checking this checkbox, you are going to have QuoteWerks create the service quote when we create the opportunity in Kaseya BMS. This is really important because if you want the line items from QuoteWerks to carry over into Kaseya, you need to have this option checked. Now, just because it's a service quote doesn't mean anything. We're going to write over the products and services from the document, so all the line items will come over into the service quote. So just keep that in mind. It won't just be your services, it'll be all line items in the document. But if you leave this unchecked, QuoteWerks will not write any of the line item information into Kaseya. We can still create the opportunity and give you the total, and you can have all of the normal functionality of your opportunities in Kaseya. You just won't be able to see the line item information that's coming from QuoteWerks. So if you want QuoteWerks to write the line item information, you need to make sure you have that option checked. The next section is the mapping section, and this is specifically for your quote summary field in Kaseya. If you want to be able to include some notes or some text about the quote that you're working on in QuoteWerks and have that information right over to the Kaseya quote summary field, you can do that here, and you can choose your fields. You'll see you have the option to choose between your introduction, closing, internal, and purchasing notes, and also the custom memo fields as well. So if you do have lengthier notes that you want to include, you can do that here. The next section is the shipping section. This is whether or not the shipping amount is going to be included in the Kaseya BMS quote. You'll need to check the checkbox, and then you'll want to give it an item name. I just called it QW shipping just for simplicity so that I know it came from QuoteWerks. And then my shipping description will simply just be shipping. If you want to change this, if you have an actual specific part number you want to use, you can set that here, but otherwise it'll just use this default information. The shipping total amount will actually come from the shipping amount field in QuoteWerks. So when you set the shipping here on your document items window, this is where that shipping amount is going to come from, and that's what will be carried over to your Kaseya quote. Okay, so let's move on to the products tab. So the products tab is made up of 4 separate sub-tabs. We have our general, mappings, empty field defaults, and product list. So we're just going to start with our general tab here. So here you'll just choose your default warehouse. I only have the one warehouse set, the main warehouse, so I'm just going to leave that selection this installation, but if you have a different one, you want to select a different one, you can. These 2 checkboxes are for new products. So if a new item that you're quoting in QuoteWerks does not exist in Kaseya and the manufacturer was not found, QuoteWerks will actually create it for you in Kaseya if you check this checkbox. If you don't want QuoteWerks to create the manufacturer for you, you can leave this unchecked. Same thing for vendors. If there's a new vendor that has not been set up in Kaseya yet and you have this checkbox set, QuoteWerks will create that new vendor/supplier if it's not found. If you don't want either of those to be updated, simply uncheck them or check them both. You can check one or the other. It's up to you what's going to work best for your company. For most users, you'll probably have both checked. On the mappings tab is where we're going to start mapping the product information from QuoteWerks over to Kaseya. First one is going to be the product name mapping. Now for 95% of you, you use the manufacturer part number in QuoteWerks as a unique identifier, and this will carry over to the Kaseya product/service name. This is how Kaseya understands that this item is a unique number, so it needs that unique identifier, which is the manufacturer part number in QuoteWerks. However, if you are going to be using some type of custom numbering sequence, maybe you have custom items, you can actually click on the drop down and select a different field to use for the numbering sequence. And you can even go into the part number generation options and actually auto generate using a macro such as like the description of the item type. There's a variety of different ways that you can set it up. This is a little more unique, so if you're going to go this route, go ahead and check out the QuoteWerks help file topic about the Kaseya auto generation, and there's more instructions in there, or contact the support team. For most of you, you're going to just leave this set as the manufacturer part number, since that's the unique identifier in QuoteWerks, and that'll carry over to the product and service name in Kaseya. Now below we have a products type tab. The products type tab is where you're going to map the QuoteWerks item type to the Kaseya item type. This is really important because what is set here determines how this item will be sent to Kaseya. So if we click on Map Item Types, on the left-hand side, we'll see our QuoteWerks item type fields, and then on the right-hand side, we'll see our Kaseya BMS item type fields. So as you can see, my fields are already mapped, but if I click on the drop-down, I could change it. So if my labor should go over as a service instead of a labor item type, I can change that. Same thing with my managed service, products, services, and if you have other QuoteWerks item types, maybe you have hardware and software and you've really gone into those item types in QuoteWerks, you can map those over to make sure that they carry over to Kaseya properly. If for any reason when you're using the Kaseya integration, your items are not being mapped properly, they're not sending over to Kaseya the correct item type, you'll just need to come in here and adjust your default mappings. And then the last option on this screen is if any of the QuoteWerks item types are not mapped, then you'll use the following item type to send over to Kaseya. So we sell a lot of products, so we use our default as products. If you sell or quote mostly services, you could set it as a service. If it's a fixed price item, you can do that. If it's a labor item, you can do that. So you have a lot of flexibility with setting the default, but this is essentially saying if you have an item type that's either left blank in QuoteWerks or it's just not mapped, maybe it's a new item type in QuoteWerks, it'll go over to Kaseya using this default mapping. Okay, so let's go over to the fixed labor period tab. And this is where you'll actually set the QuoteWerks unit of pricing to the Kaseya fixed labor period. So if you've set up units of pricing in QuoteWerks, which I haven't, then you would map them over to Kaseya for the fixed labor period. And just like the products type, if you have a unit of measure in QuoteWerks that's not mapped, the following period will be set for the item when we're setting it over to Kaseya. So if your default would typically be per hour instead of per day, you can set that. If you have a different unit of measure that you want to set, you can set that here as well. And then finally, the categories tab. This is where you'll set the QuoteWerks item type to map over to the Kaseya category. But just like the other tabs, just click on the drop down and select the proper category for the various item type in QuoteWerks, and then click OK to save your settings. Same thing here, make sure you set a default so that if the item type is not mapped to the proper category or there's not a mapping for the category, it will use this default sending the item over to Kaseya. Very important, this mapping is only going to be used when we're creating new products in Kaseya. So if the item does not exist, then we'll go ahead and use this mapping. Okay, on to the empty field defaults tab. The empty field defaults tab contains some settings for item types for line items that have either empty part numbers or have no item type. So for example, if you have an item in QuoteWerks that does not have a part number associated with it, this will be the default part number that's sent over to Kaseya. So it's sort of like a generic part number. That way we're not creating a bunch of items over and over again in Kaseya. Same thing if you're using the discount or charge line items in QuoteWerks, these will be the default part numbers that'll be sent over to Kaseya. You can customize these any way you'd like. Yours might be blank, so you can type it in. If you want to call it product line or default product, anything like that, you can do that. I simply called it QW product, QW discount, and QW charge for those types of lines if they have empty part numbers. If there's part numbers for these types of lines, QuoteWerks will send over the part numbers to Kaseya instead. Similar to the defaults for empty part numbers, these defaults are going to be for QuoteWerks lines that don't have an item type set. This will be the default that's used. So if you have a product, discount, charge, or formula line on the quote, in order for it to go over to Kaseya, you need to have some type of item type set. So if you do not set the item type, then QuoteWerks will use the default set here. You'll see here if you click on the drop down, you can choose between the various Kaseya item types that are available. I just have mine set for product for all of them, so I can adjust as needed. But since when I use these, they're typically going to be a product line item or an item that's sent over to Kaseya, these are going to be my defaults, but you can adjust and set those as necessary and just go through each line and make sure you set a default here. So let's go over to the product list tab. So the product list tab is where you can set some defaults. So if you are going to be linking QuoteWerks to the Kaseya product list and the Kaseya service list, which I'll show you how to do here in just a moment, this is where you're going to set the defaults when an item is pulled from the product list. And if there's no item type set, this is the default QuoteWerks will use. So when we pull an item from the Kaseya product list, if for some reason there's no item type set, we'll use the item type of product. Same thing for the pricing level. If there's no pricing level set, we'll set it for retail. And then for the services, same thing. If you want to set it to service or managed service or labor, something like that, you can change that setting here. Then here you can also set the default recurring billing cycle for those items that you're pulling. So in this case, I'll do monthly. And that's it. You've gone through the setup. Before we click OK, you just want to make sure you didn't miss any of the fields. So just quickly go back kind of the way you came, go through the tabs, make sure everything has a setting, all your settings are right. So look things over one last time, and then when you're ready to save your settings, click OK. And then click OK to save them. And then the final step in the process of setting up the Kaseya integration is going to be linking to the Kaseya product and services item databases. So to do that, you're going to click on Products, Set up Product Sources, and in the Product Data Source Setup window, you'll see a list of the product sources you've already set up in QuoteWerks. So to link to the Kaseya product and services databases, we're just going to need to run through the setup wizard. So to do that, click on New. And then on the drop down here, we're going to scroll down until we see the Kaseya products option. Select it and then click Next. You'll see here that you have the QuoteWerks fields on the left-hand side and the Kaseya BMS product fields on the right-hand side. This is where you can map from a specific QuoteWerks field over to a specific Kaseya field. You'll see we've mapped a few of the fields for you already, but if you wanted to map additional fields, you can do that. So for instance, if you wanted to map the unit of measure field here in Kaseya, you simply select it, and then in QuoteWerks, we would go to our own unit of measure field and then click map, and then you'll see that field has now been mapped. And you can go through this with any of the other fields. So if we wanted to map the weight, we could do unit weight and map that field. I'm not going to go through and map all of them, but you do have the option to go through and map all these additional fields over into QuoteWerks so that you have all the same field data available in both systems. Once you're done with your mappings, simply click Next and then give your database a name. We do recommend calling it Kaseya BMS products just so it's very clear what it is. If you want to call it Kaseya products instead, you can do that. If you just want to call it products, you have that option. We do typically recommend the preferred name of the vendor database so it's very clear which database this is. So I'm going to leave my default set and then click Next. The next option is if you want to set the column title for each of the columns that you've selected, you can do that here. So if you want to change a column title, we have that option. So we could choose change title, and for instance, we have this unit cost one. So if we wanted to change it to something else, we could do that. It's up to you. And you can go through and change any of those column fields that you wanted to. You can also do this at a later point as well. And then next we have our security tab. If you want to limit who has access to pull items from this database, you can make the selection here based on the user or the group they're in, and then simply click Next. And then you'll see there's two checkboxes available. There's one for disable the product source. So if you ever need to hide this database, maybe you're not pulling items from this database anymore and you just want to hide it so it doesn't show up in the product lookup window, you can always come and edit this database and choose to disable it. For us, we want to go ahead and show it. The other option is to show all the products and services when this product source is selected. So when you select this item database in QuoteWerks, if you want it to automatically load the products and services, go ahead and select this option here. This should really only be selected if you have a smaller number of items in your database. Otherwise, if you have hundreds of thousands of items, it can take a couple minutes to load. So we typically only recommend this if you have just a few hundred or a few thousand items where it'll load pretty quickly. For our example, I'm just going to leave it unchecked and then click Finish. And then you'll see here is our Kaseya products database. And we're just going to repeat this step again. So we're going to click on New, click on the drop down, select Kaseya BMS services this time, click Next. All our fields are mapped in the services database, so we're going to go ahead and click Next. Have our name, click Next, Next, set any security settings if we need to, and then finish. And then we'll go ahead and we'll close out of here. And then you can quickly check your settings just to make sure they show up by clicking on the products lookup window. And then you'll see you have your Kaseya products here and your Kaseya services here, and you can search for them to start adding them to your document. And that's it. You're all set up and you can start using the Kaseya integration. For more information, or if you have additional questions, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. There's full written instructions available in the QuoteWerks help file as well. Thanks for watching.